The following message is a presentation of Ligonier Ministries, home of the radio program Renewing Your Mind with R.C. Sproul.
We've been looking at the Christian mind, and in the course of our brief study, we've spent some time focusing on the pioneering work of the French philosopher René Descartes and his famous formula, I think, therefore I am. And I said that what Descartes was trying to do was to come to some bottom line truth, some primary proposition that was incapable of being doubted without at the same time affirming what you were doubting. As Descartes demonstrated, if you doubt that you were thinking, in order to do that, you have to be thinking. And if you're thinking, you have to be. And if you doubt that you are, you have to think to doubt that you are, and so on. And I said, why would somebody go through this intellectual gymnastic exercise just to come to the conclusion of their own existence? Well, again, the concern that Descartes had in the 17th century was to establish a certain ground for the central affirmation of the Christian faith, namely the existence of God. And before, again, I show how he attempted to do that, I want to mention something else about Descartes. That Descartes was perhaps as famous in his day for his work in the field of mathematics as he was as a philosopher. And that's not all of that unusual, particularly in past days. And if you look at modern history, the most incredible advances in modern science have often been spearheaded by the work of mathematicians. We think of the big change in science and scientific paradigms that took place earlier in the 16th century that we call the Copernican revolution. And Copernicus's challenge of the view of the world and its relationship to the universe, what was called geocentricity, namely that the Earth is the center of the universe, or at least the center of the solar system, and the idea was that the sun revolves around a fixed center in the solar system, and that that center is the Earth. And it was Copernicus who basically did the spade work to annihilate that ancient assumption that had been worked out in a very convoluted mathematical way by the Ptolemaic philosophers of antiquity. And he challenged geocentricity and replaced it with the view called heliocentricity, that is, that the sun is the center of the solar system and the planets are moving around the sun, not the sun moving around the Earth. Now you have to step back from that for just a second to try to get a sense of how radical that was. And this is the thing that caused the church to have a black eye when the bishops of the church refused to look into Galileo's telescope and condemned Galileo when he sought to confirm the Copernican theory with empirical evidence and so on. In fact, at the time of the Copernican revolution, both Martin Luther and John Calvin emphatically rejected the thesis of Copernicus. This was basically a response almost of the entire church. And for two reasons. One is that they assumed that the Bible taught that the earth was the center of the universe because the language of the Bible describes the sun moving across the sky. And of course that indicates the second reason why people were so opposed to Copernicus's theory is because when we stand where we stand in our daily lives and we look up at the sky, what do we observe? From the vantage point of our eye-witnessing of the phenomena, it certainly appears as if we are stationary and the sun is moving across the horizon. It rises in the east and sets in the west. Not only that, if somebody would have said to a person in the 13th century, do you realize that you're standing on a surface that is spinning radically around in a circle, and that the world is round and it's turning around, and you say, well, why didn't I fall off last night? All these questions of centrifugal force and centripetal force were unknown to people in those days. And so they made their judgments about the world around them chiefly on the basis of what they could see. Now, what is it that would have made a person like Copernicus to challenge something that was so deeply rooted in scientific and philosophical tradition and deeply established in terms of everybody's normal experience? Well, the key to understanding the Copernican revolution goes actually before Copernicus to some earlier astronomers and so on, who were not satisfied with the cumbersome system of mathematics that was being used in order to make all of the predictions and so on of the old science work out. And it was the mathematicians, people like Tycho Brahe and again Copernicus, who, examining the complicated mathematics that would be necessary to predict the orbits of the various heavenly planets and so on, that they could simplify the math to an enormous detail if, instead of considering the Earth as the center, if they would consider the sun as the center. And once they developed this math to the place where they fine-tuned it, they began to see a proportionate ratio of the distances from the sun of the various planets in our solar system. And later, mathematicians used their calculations and worked out these complicated proportions, and they said, wait a minute, if our calculations are correct, and this math works out in a consistent manner, there should be another planet out here somewhere. Well, then they pointed the telescope. Once the telescope was invented, and voila, they discovered another planet right where the math told them it would be. So we have to understand that great step forward in understanding our position in the vastness of this universe was stimulated initially by mathematicians. What about Newtonian physics? Again, Newton was a master mathematician. What about in our own generation, in our own century? We now describe this period of Western history as the atomic age. And the whole understanding of atomic physics has revolutionized how we live and how we think and how we understand the universe in which we live. And the genius that was behind all of this was Albert Einstein, who again was a genius in the field of mathematics. Now, what is math? It's not just arithmetic. It is something that is involved with numbers. And we go back to elementary mathematics, and we make a simple statement like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, the first question I'm going to ask is, 2 what? Plus 2 what? Equals 4 what? Well, the answer is, it doesn't matter. It can be bananas or kangaroos. If you have 2 bananas and you add to those 2 bananas 2 more bananas, how many bananas do you have? 4, okay? And it's the same thing with kangaroos. So when we talk in simple elementary math like 2 plus 2 is 4, what we're doing is that we're not being concrete and specific about various entities like bananas and kangaroos. We just simply reduce it to a mathematical formula. And this little number 2 is a symbol. And so is the number 4, and so is the equal sign. Now, what you have in the formula 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a symbolic representation of what we call a tautology. A tautology is a statement where the predicate adds nothing new in terms of information to the subject, as I've mentioned this before. A tautological statement would be something like this. a bachelor is an unmarried man. The whole idea of unmarried manness is already contained in the word bachelor. So we're getting new information when we use the predicate unmarried man, when we predicate unmarried maleness to the word bachelor. I hope I'm not confusing. I'm trying to simplify this. That is, that there is a formal truth that is affirmed in this formula. 2 plus 2 equals 4. In a simple sense, what mathematics is a kind, a very sophisticated kind, of symbolic logic. That is to say, the relationship of both sides of the equation is a rational relationship, isn't it? Now, if I said 2 plus 3 is 4, now I've got an irrational formula because it's incoherent, it violates the laws of logic, and so on. So what mathematics does is applies logic and rationality systematically in a symbolic way. Now, I'm laboring this point for a reason. What arose in the 17th century was a theory called conceptualism, which was an extreme form of the dominant movement of the 17th century, which was rationalism. Conceptualism took the tenets of rationalism to an extreme, and this is the extreme to which they went. They were arguing that anything that could be conceived of as being internally coherent and logical must exist in reality. And you had people running around the world searching for unicorns because they said, now, a unicorn is not an animal that is inconceivable. And anything that could be conceived of rationally must necessarily exist in the real world. And this has to do with one of the classical arguments for the existence of God. But I'm not going to mention that except in passing at this point. Now, when we look at that from the vantage point of the 20th century, we think, well, that's silly. The mind has the ability to exercise abstraction, to extend categories. I look at various animals, and I see that lots of animals have legs. And, in fact, almost all of them do. And we see certain animals that have 4 legs. And we can conceive of a 4-legged animal, a horse. We have an idea of horseness in our minds. But we also know of rhinoceroses, and they have this big old horn right on the front of their nose. And so all we have to do, being sort of playing like Dr. Seuss, is transfer the idea of the horn from the rhinoceros and put it on the nose of the horse, and what do we have? We've got a unicorn. Makes sense? There's nothing irrational about the idea of a unicorn. There's no reason why unicorns couldn't exist. But who in this world would say that just because we can doodle on a page and transfer body parts from one kind of animal to another, that therefore these animals exist? Well, we don't think like that. But for a very short period of time, there were people that got carried away and were thinking in these terms, that if you can conceive of it rationally, it must exist. Now, the reason for that is because of the enormous confidence that people began to have in mathematics. Since mathematics is a rational science, is a logical science, it formalizes concepts, and mathematics had led to the discovery of all kinds of things, people's confidence in that particular discipline now was elevated to the nth degree. Do you see that? Do you see how that could happen? Now, we don't need to worry about conceptualism now, but so much confidence was rendered in math because mathematics was based upon a system that was always consistent logically. Mathematics is a science that is inherently rational. In fact, sometimes when I look at where we are in our culture today, where we have embraced in a wholesale manner the irrationality, the absurd of Eastern religion and existential philosophy and relativism and all of that sort of thing, I say, who is going to save us from this immersion into absurdity? I don't think it's going to be the philosophers, because they're enjoying it, and it probably won't be the theologians, because we've seen theology in the 20th century embrace this irrationality. But the one place it doesn't work is on your computer screen. And that's because if we're going to continue this explosion of technology, we can't throw away the fundamental rational consistency of mathematics. And so to me, I look to the secular scientists, the naturalists, in the final analysis to save us from this pervasive spirit of irrationality. But again, I'm just emphasizing, Descartes was a mathematician before he was a philosopher. And as the father of rationalism, he was looking for the kind of truth that is delivered by mathematics. Because the 2 + 2 = 4, that conclusion, the 2 and 2 gives us 4, is one that comes from a resistless logic. It is indubitable. Now, I know I've seen people, and somebody's going to write in and call in and say, wait a minute, I can show you a complex way that if you do this mathematical form, I can prove to you that 2 and 2 are 5. I've seen the formulas, I've seen all of that stuff done. And I'm just going to tell you right now, before you call and before you write, don't do it, because whenever that little trick is done, it always involves what's called in logic the problem of equivocation, where terms change their meaning in the middle of this complex progression, and that vitiates the conclusion. So save your energy. In any case, what Descartes was looking for was a way that he said that he could crawl into his Dutch oven and hide there in this oven. It's like somebody going into a cave. And without the benefit of any research, any empirical data, that he could sit there and deduce the grand truths of the real world just by the application of formal logic and deduction, if he could find a starting point. Like Archimedes, he was looking for a lever long enough and a place to put it, he could move the earth. So for Descartes, the leverage he was looking for was a clear and distinct idea whose truth was incapable of being doubted. A formal affirmation that was certain, from which he could then crawl into his Dutch oven and deduce all truth. This is what we call thinking that is a priori. Maybe you've heard of that term, maybe you haven't. It's a common term in philosophy. A priori means simply before experience. That I don't have to go out and experience it. I can know it by deduction, by sheer logical inference. My daddy used to say something like this when he would say, you don't have to live in a garbage can to know that it stinks. When I would argue, I have to experience life, Dad. It's like, all you have to do is go close to the garbage can. You have to jump in it to know that it stinks. That's not exactly the same thing. But what Descartes, he didn't want to jump in a garbage can. He wanted to jump in his Dutch oven and there deduce the central truths of all reality prior to experience, without having to see it, taste it, touch it, smell it, hear it, and so on. And so that's the procedure that he would follow to try to establish the truth of the existence of God. It might be a fun exercise for us to just step back for a moment from all of the knowledge explosion that we experience in our day and just say, wait a minute, how much of this advance has been provoked by mathematics? There's a reason why mathematics is stressed in the educational curriculum for the development of children. Because in this arena, more than any other, children's rational thinking processes are developed. They don't realize that when they're studying math, they're actually studying a form of logic. They are studying a kind of symbolic logic, where the equations are abstract symbolic representations of certain actions and quantities. And so it's very important for us to see that as human beings, that God has made us and made the world in which we live in a kind of magnificent symmetry of mathematical proportionality. And key to our exploration of the world in which we live is the application of this science that makes use of what? The mind preeminently.
For more information about Ligonier Ministries, call 1-800-435-4343 or contact us on the web at ligonier.org. That's ligonier.org. Or write P.O. Box 54 7500, Orlando, Florida 32854.